For 2 years after my husband, Robert, passed away from a sudden heart attack, silence was my closest companion. It wasn't an entirely unwelcome one. After 35 years as a financial investigator for the IRS, I'd certainly earned a bit of quiet. My life, once a bustling duet with the man I'd loved since I was 20, had settled into a predictable, orderly solo. Coffee at dawn, tending to the fiery red roses Robert had planted for our 25th anniversary, and a meticulous review of my finances every Friday morning. It was a ritual, a way of maintaining control in a world that had felt so utterly out of control since his funeral. It was my anchor in the lonely sea of widowhood. It was on one of these Fridays, with the scent of coffee hanging in the air and the morning sun slanting across my desk, that the first hairline crack appeared in the carefully constructed facade of my life. I sat at the solid oak desk Robert had built with his own hands, a steaming mug of black coffee at my elbow. In front of me were my bank statements, neat columns of black and red that usually brought me a sense of peace. Everything was in order. My pension, my carefully managed investments, the small inheritance from my parents safely tucked away in a low-risk bond fund. And then there was the payment from my son, Thomas. $4,000, as regular as clockwork, deposited on the first of every month. For 4 years, that payment had been part of our arrangement. When Thomas and his wife Victoria had wanted to buy a house in a competitive neighborhood near his work, they were devastated to learn they didn't qualify for a mortgage. Thomas's student loans from his MBA were a substantial burden, and Victoria's freelance income as a yoga instructor was too inconsistent for the bank's rigid criteria. I remembered the look on my son's face, that familiar shadow of disappointment I'd seen since he was a little boy who'd struck out at a championship baseball game. It was a look I couldn't bear. So I had stepped in. Using a significant portion of Robert's life insurance money, money I had earmarked for my own long-term care, for the day I might need it, I bought the house for them outright. A lovely $520,000 colonial with a big yard and a beautiful maple tree out front. We agreed they would pay me a monthly amount, equivalent to what their mortgage would have been. In my mind, it wasn't rent. It was their way of contributing, of maintaining their pride and building equity in their future. I put the money into a separate savings account, a secret nest egg I planned to give back to Thomas one day, perhaps for his own children's college fund. It was a mother's secret, a final gift from his father. But as I sat there, staring at the $4,000 transaction, a familiar unease prompted me to open my laptop to Victoria's social media page. It had become a guilty, unsettling habit. Her feed was a glossy magazine of a life I couldn't reconcile with their finances. There she was, last week, posing on a balcony in Cabo, a turquoise ocean sparkling behind her, a cocktail in her hand. The caption read, "Another spontaneous getaway, #blessed." 2 weeks before that, a selfie taken in the gleaming interior of a new car, showing off a brand new designer handbag, one I knew from a quick, horrified search, retailed for over $3,000. Then there was the new luxury SUV parked in the driveway of my house in their Christmas photos, a giant red bow on the hood. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Thomas's salary as a mid-level marketing manager was decent, but it wasn't extravagant. How could they afford all this? I had always pushed the thought away, telling myself I was being an interfering old-fashioned mother-in-law. It's their life, Eleanor, I'd scold myself. Maybe Victoria's yoga business is booming. That afternoon, my best friend Margaret called. We'd started at the IRS on the same day, 2 young women in a sea of men, and had retired within 6 months of each other. She was the only person I could be truly honest with, the only one who had seen me at my best and my worst. "You're quiet today," she said, her voice as sharp and perceptive as ever over the phone. "Staring at those bank statements again, aren't you?" I sighed, tracing the rim of my now cold coffee cup. "It's Friday," she said simply. "Talk to me, Elle. What's eating you?" I told her everything. The handbag, the spontaneous vacations, the new car. It just doesn't add up, Marge. The numbers don't match the lifestyle. I ran the math. After their payment to me, their car payments, and basic living expenses, they should be in the red every month, not flying to Mexico. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I'm going to say something, and you know it's because I love you, she began, and I braced myself. I told you from day one there was something about that girl I didn't trust. Remember at the wedding? The way she looked at your mother's pearls, like she was calculating their carat weight and resale value? She's got the eyes of an appraiser, not a daughter-in-law. I remembered. I had dismissed it as wedding day jitters, as a young woman being overwhelmed. People who are truly struggling to make mortgage payments don't go to Cabo. They go to the state park for a picnic. My cousin's daughter, you remember Susan? Her husband's son-in-law was just like that, charming as all get out, always flashing cash. Turned out he was running a credit card scam and had drained Susan's retirement account. You are a good mother, Elle, but you are not a fool. Or at least you never used to be. Her words stung because they were true. My professional life had been dedicated to finding the truth hidden in spreadsheets and financial records. I could smell a lie from a mile away. Why was I so determined to ignore the one being lived in my own backyard, under a roof I owned? I said, they're having a dinner party tonight for Thomas's boss and some colleagues. A chance for him to make a good impression for a potential promotion. Are you going? I have to. It's important to Thomas. Then go, Margaret said, her tone softening slightly. But for God's sake, go with your eyes open. Put on your old IRS hat. Go as Investigator Vance, not just as mom. Watch, listen, and trust your gut. It's never steered you wrong before. Her advice settled over me, heavy as a lead blanket, but also strangely comforting. She was right. For 4 years, I had chosen to be willfully blind out of love for my son. I had let the quiet grief for Robert soften my edges, dull my sharpest instincts. As I got ready for the party that evening, choosing a simple but elegant navy dress, I felt a familiar cold resolve settling in my chest. I wasn't going to dinner just to support my son. I was going on a fact-finding mission. I was going to observe. I was going to listen. I was going to look for the truth behind the perfect, expensive facade they had built inside my house.
The house was dazzling. Victoria had a flair for presentation, I had to give her that. Soft lighting glowed from every corner, the scent of expensive lilies, my least favorite flower, a fact she knew well, hung in the air, and a quiet, sophisticated jazz playlist murmured from hidden speakers. It felt less like a home and more like a stage set. Every cushion plumped, every surface gleaming. It was a picture of effortless wealth. And I knew better than anyone how much effort and money it took to look so effortless. Thomas greeted me at the door, giving me a quick, distracted hug. He looked handsome in his tailored suit, but there were faint lines of stress around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. "Mom, you made it. Glad you're here," he said, his eyes already looking over my shoulder for his boss. "Try to, have a good time. It's a big night." "I'll try my best," I said, my voice drier than I intended. Victoria swept in, a vision in a shimmering silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Eleanor, you look comfortable," she said, her eyes giving my simple dress a quick, dismissive scan before landing on the modest pearl earrings Robert had given me. For a second, I saw Margaret's words in her gaze. She kissed the air beside my cheek, a cloud of cloying perfume enveloping me. "Now, remember, Mr. Henderson is the one with the gray hair. He's the senior VP, he's very important, so let's all be on our best behavior." The implication was clear. Don't embarrass us. I spent the first hour making polite, meaningless small talk, nursing a single glass of club soda with a lime wedge. I watched, I listened, I saw the way Victoria commanded the room, her laughter bright and perfectly timed, a hand placed lightly on an important arm here, a shared conspiratorial glance there. And I saw the way Thomas followed in her wake, his smile looking increasingly strained as the evening wore on, like a man playing a part he hadn't fully memorized. And I saw his boss, Mr. Henderson, a portly man with a booming laugh, look around the house with an appreciative, almost envious air. "You two have done very well for yourselves," I overheard him say to Thomas. My son just nodded, a flush creeping up his neck. We finally sat down for dinner at a long, polished dining table that I knew for a fact had been charged to a credit card I'd helped them consolidate the debt on 2 years prior. The conversation was all about business, marketing strategies, and corporate growth. I remained silent, a quiet observer at the end of the table, feeling more like an anthropologist studying a strange tribe than a mother at her son's dinner party. Then, Mr. Henderson, perhaps feeling he'd been ignoring me, turned his attention my way. "Eleanor, Thomas tells me you had a long and distinguished career with the IRS. That must have been fascinating work." Before I could formulate a reply, Victoria cut in with a tinkling, artificial laugh. "Oh, it was ages ago. Mom's been retired for a few years now. Enjoying the quiet life, aren't you, Eleanor?" There was something in her tone, a patronizing sweetness that set my teeth on edge. It was the voice one uses for a child or a pet. "I retired for health reasons shortly after my husband passed. 35 years was a good run." Mr. Henderson nodded respectfully. "A well-deserved rest, I'm sure. My own father was a federal agent. A tough job." But Victoria wasn't done. She saw an opportunity, a way to play a particular card in front of this powerful audience. She leaned forward, placing a hand on her husband's arm in a gesture of loving support. "Thomas and I are so grateful for all the sacrifices his mother made. It's such a shame her health declined when it did. We worry, of course. She lives all alone in that big house, and at her age, sometimes things can get confusing." The table fell quiet. The air crackled with a sudden uncomfortable tension. She was painting a picture, and the brushstrokes were broad and cruel. I was no longer a respected federal investigator. I was a fragile, slightly dotty old woman. My mind, my greatest asset, the tool I had honed for over 30 decades, was being publicly questioned and dismissed. A younger colleague of Thomas's, a woman named Sarah, tried to break the awkward silence. "So, what do you do to keep busy now, Mrs. Vance?" she asked, her smile a little too bright. And that's when Victoria delivered the killing blow. She smiled, a wide, pitying smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. Bless her heart, she tries to keep up. But let's be honest, her working days are long behind her. We've told her she doesn't need to worry about a thing. She said, her voice dripping with false concern. Then she looked directly at Mr. Henderson, making him a co-conspirator in her narrative of my decline. "It's been a bit of a transition for her. She's not quite as sharp as she used to be. You know how it is. But her heart is pure gold." The room was thick with a mortifying silence. They were all looking at me with a mixture of pity and discomfort. She had just neutered me, dismissed my entire life's work and my intellect in 2 sentences. In her narrative, I was a doddering old woman, a charity case, a burden she and Thomas graciously shouldered. I saw the strategy with perfect chilling clarity. If I ever questioned them, if I ever raised a concern, who would believe the confused old lady over the successful, charming, concerned young couple? I felt a glacial calm spread through my veins. The hurt was there, a sharp, visceral sting, but it was quickly being subsumed by a cold, hard anger. My hands, resting in my lap, curled into fists. This wasn't a careless insult. This was a calculated move. This was warfare. I didn't react. I didn't defend myself. That's what she wanted. An emotional outburst would have only proven her point. So I just smiled. It was a tight, thin smile that I could feel stretching the skin on my face. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes. And it was a smile that only Victoria seemed to understand because, for a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her own gaze.
The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. When the guests finally left, Thomas was beaming, shaking his boss's hand enthusiastically at the door. Once it was closed, he turned to Victoria and pulled her into a hug. "That was perfect, honey. They were so impressed. I think I've got that promotion in the bag." Victoria preened. Then her eyes fell on me, still sitting quietly at the table. "See, Eleanor? A lovely evening. All's well that ends well." I stood up slowly, my joints protesting the long period of tense stillness. I picked up my purse. Yes, it was very, illuminating. I walked towards the door, Thomas and Victoria following, their minds already celebrating their social victory. "Drive safe, Mom," he said, his mind clearly on his future salary increase. I paused at the door and turned back to face them, the perfect couple framed in the warm, deceptive light of the hallway.
"I think," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of 35 years of authority, "that it's time we had a talk about the ownership of this house and about my mental acuity. We can do it tomorrow." The triumphant smiles vanished from their faces as if wiped clean. Thomas looked utterly confused, but Victoria's expression was one of pure, unadulterated shock. The mask had slipped. In that moment, she knew she had made a critical, perhaps fatal, miscalculation. She had poked a bear she thought was asleep. And now, that bear was wide awake. The real investigation was about to begin. The drive home was a silent 10-minute journey through quiet suburban streets, but my mind was a roaring inferno. The fog of grief and inaction that had clouded my judgment for 2 years had been burned away by the cold fire of Victoria's calculated cruelty. By the time I walked into my own quiet house, the scent of my own life, old books and lemon polish, a stark contrast to the cloying lilies at theirs, I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was investigator Eleanor Vance, and I had just been handed a new case, my most important one. I didn't sleep. Instead, I went to my office, the room Robert had always called my war room. It was where I'd pored over the complex tax shelters of millionaires and the petty scams of small-time crooks. I pulled out a large, fresh whiteboard from the closet, the kind I used to use for mapping out complex fraud networks. At the top, in bold black marker, I wrote 2 names, Victoria and Thomas Vance. Underneath, I drew a thick, uncompromising line. Below it, I wrote, "The truth." My first rule of any investigation was to operate on facts, not feelings. The anger and hurt were fuel, but logic had to be the engine. I started with what I knew for certain. Thomas's annual salary was approximately $95,000. After federal, state, and local taxes, plus his 401k contribution, his take-home pay was roughly $6,000 a month. Their monthly mortgage payment to me was $4,000. That left them with $2,000 for everything else: utilities, groceries, 2 car payments, one for a luxury SUV I now noted with a grimace, insurance, clothes, student loan repayments, and apparently spontaneous trips to Cabo and designer handbags that cost more than their entire monthly food budget. The math wasn't just tight, it was impossible. So, I turned my full attention to her business. Victoria's Vinyasa, she called it. Her website was a masterpiece of branding, professional, serene, full of smiling photos of her in complicated yoga poses against beautiful backdrops. It listed class schedules and private session rates. A single private session was $150. A block of 10 was $1,200. I scrolled to the bottom of the booking page and found the fine print. Cash or Venmo preferred for a special discounted rate. Cash. The word lit up in my brain like a neon sign in a dark alley. It was the lifeblood of the underground economy, the currency of tax evasion. For the next 3 days, I lived in my war room. I felt a dormant part of myself reawaken, the sharp, analytical mind that had been my trademark. I was rusty, but the old skills came back quickly. I put on my investigator's hat and dove into the open-source intelligence of the internet. I tracked her online class advertisements on community forums, local mommy blogs, and social media. I cross-referenced them with the public schedules of the 3 boutique gyms she rented space from. I built a spreadsheet, a beautiful, orderly grid logging every class, every workshop, every private wellness retreat, she advertised. The work was meticulous, and it was deeply satisfying. I created a fake email address and a phony social media profile. Brenda K., new to town. A wealthy, bored housewife new to the area with stock photos of a generic McMansion and a fluffy white dog. I reached out to Victoria, inquiring about an intensive package of private sessions. Her response was swift and friendly. She offered me a new client cash special that was significantly lower than her advertised rate. She sent me her schedule. She was booked solid, 5 days a week, with a mix of private clients and group classes. She was a machine. Working backwards, I conservatively estimated she was teaching 20 private sessions a week, plus another 5 group classes. That was at a bare minimum an income of over $3,500 a week, or $14,000 a month, over $168,000 a year, almost all of it likely undeclared cash. I felt a grim, cold satisfaction. This was familiar territory. This was the kind of blatant, arrogant financial deception I had unraveled for a living. I now had my first piece of concrete, undeniable evidence: massive tax fraud. My son called on the 3rd day, right on schedule. His voice was strained, walking a tightrope between the confusion I had created and the loyalty Victoria demanded. "Mom, what was that the other night? You made things really awkward after Mr. Henderson left. Victoria's really upset. She cried all night." "I bet she did," I thought. "Is she?" I asked calmly, staring at the whiteboard, now covered in figures and arrows connecting shell companies to cash flow. "Yes, she said you looked at her like you hated her all night. She thinks you're jealous of our happiness, of our success." I took a deep breath, forcing the anger down. I had to play this carefully. "Thomas, I want you to answer me a question, and I want you to be honest. Does it ever seem strange to you that you can afford so much on your salary?" There was a long pause. I could hear his defensiveness building like a wall. "Victoria is doing really well," he said, his voice stiff. "Her business has taken off. She works hard, harder than anyone I know." "I'm sure she does," I said. "But hard work has to be reported to the government, son. That's how we pay for roads and schools and the military. It's a lesson I thought you learned growing up at my dinner table." "What are you implying? That she's some kind of criminal? Mom, you're looking for problems where there aren't any. You've been different since Dad died. Everyone says so. You're paranoid." The words were a punch to the gut, but I recognized them for what they were. Victoria's words coming out of my son's mouth. She's been feeding him this narrative that I'm unstable, grieving, unreliable. "I'm just a mother concerned about her son's financial and legal exposure," I said, my voice turning to ice. "You are married. You file a joint tax return. Her liabilities are your liabilities. If the IRS were to conduct an audit, they would come after you both. They would seize your assets, the house, the car, your savings, your 401k, everything." "You're being ridiculous," he said, but for the first time I heard a flicker of genuine fear in his voice. I had hit a nerve. The idea of losing his hard-earned security was a potent threat. "Am I? Ask her to show you her business tax returns for the last 4 years, Thomas. Ask her to show you the quarterly estimated tax payments she's been making. It's a simple request. If she can produce those documents, I will apologize to you both and never mention it again." I knew she couldn't. The long, heavy silence on the other end of the line was my answer. "I have to go," he finally mumbled and hung up. I sank back into my chair, the phone feeling heavy in my hand. I had planted the seed of doubt, but I also knew it wasn't enough. Thomas was in too deep, blinded by what he thought was love, but what I was beginning to suspect was a sophisticated form of manipulation. Victoria had insulated him, made him dependent on the lifestyle she provided, and skillfully positioned me as the enemy. My initial plan had been to confront them with the tax evasion and use it as leverage to get them out of the house. But now, I realized the problem was bigger. This wasn't just about greed. The calculated way Victoria had tried to discredit my mental state felt like something more than a simple desire for a bigger house. It felt strategic. It felt predatory. My investigation couldn't stop at the money. I had to understand who, exactly, my son had married. The whiteboard felt too small. The deception, I suspected, was far deeper than a little undeclared cash. And a cold, terrifying thought crept into my mind. What if the yoga business was just the tip of the iceberg? The conversation with Thomas left me shaken, but resolute. He was a pawn in a game I didn't yet understand, and appealing to his reason was pointless, as long as Victoria was the one controlling the board. He was compromised. I had to go deeper, and I had to do it alone. The question that haunted me, the one I scribbled in red marker on my whiteboard, was, where does the cash go? $14,000 a month in cash is a logistical problem. You don't just deposit that into a joint checking account without raising red flags with the bank, which are required by federal law to report any cash transactions over $10,000. Victoria was clearly smarter than that. She had a system. I needed to find it. This part of the investigation was beyond my keyboard skills. I needed eyes and ears on the ground. I thought about hiring a private investigator, but the thought of bringing a stranger into this deeply personal mess felt wrong. A violation. Then I remembered Richard Rick Peterson. He was a retired police detective, a grizzled old-school cop who had occasionally consulted on joint task force cases with the IRS. He was discreet, thorough, and owed me a favor after I'd helped untangle his mother's complicated estate tax situation years ago, saving him a small fortune. We had a bond forged in the fires of bureaucratic paperwork. I found his number in my old address book and called him. "Rick, it's Eleanor Vance." "Elle, blessed from the past. I thought you were off enjoying the good life, playing bridge and spoiling grandkids," he boomed, his voice a familiar gravelly rasp. "Something like that," I said. "Listen, I have a sensitive family matter. It's not official business, it's personal. I need some financial surveillance. I need to know where cash payments are being deposited. It's for my daughter-in-law's business." I didn't give him the whole story. I just told her she ran a cash-heavy business and I was worried about my son's liability. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. Rick, bless his professional heart, didn't ask too many questions. He knew the tone of a serious request. "Say no more," he said. "Family stuff is the worst. I've got a guy. He's good, invisible as a ghost. He'll get you what you need. Consider that favor repaid." The week I waited for his report was agonizing. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. I barely slept, my mind racing through possibilities. Was she hiding it in a safe deposit box? Was she involved in something even worse, like money laundering? The not knowing was a physical weight on my shoulders. Finally, a plain manila envelope with no return address arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a typewritten report and a series of grainy but clear photographs. Rick's report was concise and professional. For 3 days, his operative had followed Victoria after she finished her private yoga sessions. She didn't go to a bank. Instead, she drove to a check-cashing store in a rundown strip mall 2 towns over, the kind with barred windows and neon signs advertising payday loans. In the photos, she was wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, a completely different person from the glamorous hostess at the dinner party. She was handing over thick wads of cash and receiving cashier's checks in return. From there, she went to a post office and mailed the checks in a priority envelope. The operative had gotten a clear shot of the address label. The report listed the address, a P.O. box in Scottsdale, Arizona. Arizona! The word seemed to hum with significance. Why Arizona? They had no family there, no friends that I knew of. Thomas had never mentioned any connection to the state. It made no sense. This was the piece that didn't fit, the loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry of her lies. I called Rick, thanked him profusely, and wired him the money for his operative's time. I told him his services were no longer needed. This next part had to be done by me. This was my family, my fight. I turned my attention to the P.O. box. A simple online search revealed it was registered to a corporation called Sonar Sun Wellness, LLC. It sounded like another yoga or health-based company. Perhaps it was her parent company, a clever way to funnel money for tax purposes, creating a complex corporate shield. I dug into the Arizona Corporate Registry, a public database I'd used countless times in my career. My heart hammered in my chest as I typed in the name, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The registration documents popped up on my screen, a dry, bureaucratic PDF file that felt like the Rosetta Stone. Sonam Sun Wellness, LLC was formed 5 years ago, a year before she even met Thomas. I scanned the list of corporate officers, expecting to see Victoria's name or perhaps a variation of it. It wasn't there. My eyes scrolled down the page, past the legal jargon, and then they landed on the name of the sole registered agent and director. My breath caught in my throat. I had to read the name once, twice, a third time, making sure my tired eyes weren't deceiving me. Catherine Schmidt. Who was Catherine Schmidt? The name was unfamiliar, yet it felt monumental. It was the key. Victoria was sending thousands of dollars a month, the undeclared profits from her Ohio business, to a woman I'd never heard of, in a state she had no apparent connection to. Was she being blackmailed? Was she in debt to someone from a past life? Or was it something else entirely? Something more sinister? My investigator brain took over, pushing aside the wild, emotional theories. I had a new name, a new lead. I cleared a large space on my whiteboard and wrote in big block letters, "Who is Catherine Schmidt?" I spent the next 48 hours in a caffeine-fueled frenzy, running that name through every database I could access. I used public record searches, professional networking sites, and even old-school newspaper archive searches. At first, there was nothing. It was a common enough name. But then I narrowed my search, adding Scottsdale and keywords like yoga, wellness, or business owner.
And then I found it. It wasn't in a business journal or a legal database. It was in an online Scottsdale community newsletter, buried in the social announcements section. It was a small, cheerful announcement from 6 months ago, celebrating the marriage of a prominent local businessman, a successful construction company owner named Nathan Wilson. His new bride was a woman described as a wellness entrepreneur and yoga guru. Her name was Catherine Schmidt. The announcement included a photo. It was a picture of the happy couple, beaming, their hands joined as they cut a multi-tiered wedding cake. Nathan Wilson was handsome, silver-haired, and looked to be in his late 50s. And the woman on his arm, the smiling bride in the elegant white dress, was my son's wife. It was Victoria. The world tilted on its axis. The air in my office grew thin and cold, and I had to grip the edge of my desk to steady myself as a wave of dizziness washed over me. It wasn't possible. It was a mistake. A look-alike. It had to be. I stared at the photograph on my screen, zooming in until the pixels blurred into a mosaic of light and color. I zoomed back out. The face was undeniably hers. The same bright, false smile she gave me at the dinner party. The same cold calculation in the eyes. A look that was there even on her supposed wedding day. The same delicate mole just above her lip. Victoria was a bigamist. My son was married to a woman who was already married to someone else. The floor seemed to drop out under me. All the pieces of the puzzle, the frantic need for money, the secrecy, the undeclared cash, the money being funneled to Arizona, clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening snap.
It wasn't a business account she was sending money to. It was her account, her other life. She was systematically stripping cash from her yoga business in Ohio and sending it to an account she controlled under her other name in her other marriage. And God only knows what she was doing to this Nathan Wilson's finances. He looked wealthy, very wealthy. My first instinct was pure, primal rage. I wanted to print the photo, drive to her house, and slap it down on their polished dining room table. I wanted to scream and rage and watch her world burn to the ground. I wanted to see the look on my son's face when he finally saw the truth. But as quickly as the anger came, it was replaced by a chilling, paralyzing fear. This wasn't a cheating wife. This wasn't a simple gold digger. This was something far more dangerous. This level of deception, of meticulous planning, of living a complete double life, it was the work of a professional, a predator. My son wasn't just a fool in a bad marriage, he was a mark. He was a victim. And he was in danger. What was her endgame? Was she planning to drain them both and disappear? Was Thomas just a cover, a respectable suburban husband to mask her real operations? I sank into my chair, my body trembling. For a moment, the weight of it all was too much. I was just a 67-year-old widow alone in her quiet house. How could I fight this? This was a monster I couldn't even comprehend. I looked at the framed photo of Robert on my desk, his kind, steady eyes smiling at me from a happier time, a family vacation to the Grand Canyon. "What would you do, Rob?" I asked his memory. His answer was immediate and clear in my mind, his voice a familiar comfort. "You protect our boy, Elle, whatever it takes." The fear receded, pushed back by the same cold resolve I'd felt after the dinner party, only now it was 100 times stronger, forged into steel by the terror I felt for my son. This was no longer about respect or getting my house back. This was about saving my son from a woman who was, for all intents and purposes, a monster. I pushed away from the computer and forced myself to walk to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, my hands shaking so badly I sloshed hot water on the counter. I had to think. I had to create a new plan. A direct confrontation was out of the question. It would be amateurish and dangerous. It would only give her time to run, to disappear, to cover her tracks, and maybe even to hurt Thomas in the process. I couldn't predict what a person like this was capable of when cornered. No, I had to act as she did, with calculation, with strategy, and with overwhelming, irrefutable evidence. I needed to build a case so airtight that when I finally made my move, she would have no escape. My mind started working again, the familiar clicks of an investigation falling into place. I now had two names, Victoria Vance and Catherine Schmidt. I had two husbands, Thomas Vance and Nathan Wilson. I had a trail of money. What I didn't have was the full picture. Was this her first time, or was she a serial operator? The way she had so coolly tried to establish me as mentally incompetent suggested a practiced, methodical cruelty. The tax fraud was a powerful weapon, but bigamy and large-scale financial fraud were nuclear options. I had to gather every piece of evidence before I could detonate them. I spent the rest of the night creating a new file, a thick 3-ring binder that I labeled simply Project Nightingale. The name came to me suddenly. The nightingale was a bird with a beautiful, enchanting song, but it was also a creature of the night, of deception and darkness. It felt fitting. I printed everything. The social media posts showcasing their lavish lifestyle, the bank statements showing the cash deposits, the yoga class advertisements, the corporate registration for Sonoran Sun Wellness, and of course, the wedding announcement from Scottsdale. I carefully arranged them in chronological order, inserting tab dividers for each category of evidence. I created a timeline of her life since she'd met Thomas, marking every major purchase, every trip, every suspicious event. It was a biography of a lie. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light into my office, I looked at the binder. It was thick, heavy, and damning. It was the beginning of the end for her. But I also knew I couldn't do this alone anymore. This was bigger than a family dispute. This had crossed the line into serious criminal activity. I needed allies. I needed to contact Nathan Wilson, and then, together, we needed to go to the police. A deep sadness settled over me, a counterweight to my righteous anger. This was the end of my son's marriage, the end of the life he thought he had. It would shatter him. A part of me, the mother, wept for the pain he was about to endure. But another part of me, the investigator, knew that the truth, no matter how brutal, was the only thing that could set him free. The beautiful house I had bought him had become a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies, and it was my job to tear it down before he was buried in the rubble.
Contacting Nathan Wilson was the most delicate and dangerous part of my plan. A wrong move could spook him or, worse, tip off Victoria. If he called her to say some crazy woman was making accusations, my entire investigation would be compromised. An email could be intercepted. A phone call could be dismissed as a prank from a crazy person. I had to do it in person. It was the only way he would understand the gravity of the situation and believe me. It was the only way I could look him in the eye and see if he was a victim or a co-conspirator, though my gut told me it was the former. I booked a flight to Phoenix for the following Tuesday, telling Thomas I was visiting an old friend from the IRS who had retired in Sun City. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was a necessary evil in a war of deception. I packed a small overnight bag and a briefcase containing the Nightingale binder. As the plane took off, leaving the green fields of Ohio behind for the stark desert, I felt a strange sense of calm. I was in my element, on the hunt. I landed in the blistering Arizona heat and rented a nondescript sedan, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I felt like a spy in a movie, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. This was real. The lives of at least 2 men, my son included, were hanging in the balance. Nathan Wilson's construction company was housed in a sleek, modern building on the outskirts of Scottsdale, a testament to his success. I hadn't made an appointment. Walking in cold was a risk, but it was better than giving him advance warning. I walked into the cool, marble-floored lobby and told the polite young receptionist that I was an old family friend of Catherine's from Ohio and wanted to surprise her husband with some news from back home. It was a gamble, but it paid off. She smiled and, after a brief call, told me Mr. Wilson would see me. Nathan Wilson was exactly as he appeared in the wedding photo. Tall, confident, with a warm, easy smile and the kind of deep tan that spoke of weekend golf games. He welcomed me into a large, sun-drenched office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the desert landscape. "It's a pleasure to meet you," he said, shaking my hand firmly. His grip was strong, his eyes clear and direct. "Catherine has told me so little about her life in Ohio. It's all a bit of a mystery." "I'm here to solve that mystery, Mr. Wilson," I said, my voice steady. I sat down in the plush leather chair he offered and opened my briefcase, pulling out the Project Nightingale binder. "My name is Eleanor Vance, and I'm afraid what I have to tell you is going to be very difficult to hear." His smile faltered, replaced by a look of polite confusion. I didn't waste any time with pleasantries. I started from the beginning. I told him my son's name was Thomas Vance. I told him Thomas had been married to a woman named Victoria for the past 4 years. And then I turned the binder around and pushed a photograph across the polished expanse of his desk. It was a photo from Thomas and Victoria's wedding, the 2 of them smiling, cutting their own cake. He stared at it, his face paling beneath his tan. "That's my Kate," he whispered, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "This must be some kind of joke, a prank." "I wish it were," I said softly. Then I showed him their Ohio marriage certificate with Victoria's signature clear as day. Then I showed him his own marriage certificate from Las Vegas with Catherine Schmidt's signature. I laid them side by side. The handwriting was identical. Victoria Vance, Catherine Schmidt. The same woman. 2 husbands. For a full minute, he said nothing. He just stared at the documents, his face a mask of disbelief. I watched as the confident CEO in front of me crumbled, the reality of the deception crashing down on him. He slumped back in his chair, looking 10 years older. "The money," he finally said, his voice hoarse. He ran a hand through his silver hair. She convinced me to put her name on several of my investment accounts for estate planning purposes, she said, to avoid probate if anything happened to me. She created that LLC, Sonoran Sun Wellness, to manage our joint assets from her business. He let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Our assets. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me, staring out at the unchanging desert. I'm such a fool. I lost my first wife to cancer 3 years ago. I was so lonely. And then Kate, she was so vibrant, so full of life. She made me feel young again. She listened to me. I thought... His voice trailed off. She's a professional, Nathan, I said gently, getting up and standing a respectful distance away. You and my son are not her first victims. I'm sure of it. She preys on good, trusting people. She finds their vulnerabilities and exploits them. Your vulnerability was grief. My son's was insecurity. He turned around, his eyes filled not with sadness but with a hard, cold anger that mirrored my own. The CEO was back. What do? We don't confront her, I said immediately. We don't give her the chance to run. We gather everything, every financial statement, every email, every document that proves her fraud. And then we go to the police, together. He nodded, his jaw tight. I'll have my forensic accountant go through everything tonight. He'll find every penny she's moved. She won't know what hit her. 2 days later, armed with a mountain of evidence from both Ohio and Arizona, including Nathan's accountant report, which showed she had already siphoned over $200,000 from his accounts, we walked into the Scottsdale Police Department. We were directed to a detective in the Economic Crimes Unit. Her name was Lisa Summers, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She laid out the entire story, spreading the documents across her desk. She listened intently, her expression unreadable, asking clarifying questions with surgical precision. She examined the marriage certificates, the bank transfers, the corporate filings. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at us. She didn't look surprised. Mrs. Vance, Mr. Wilson, she said, her voice calm, thank you for bringing this to us. You've put together a more thorough case than most of my junior detectives could. This is excellent work. She paused, then opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a file. She opened it, and on top was a photograph. It was a driver's license photo of Victoria, looking younger, harder. Her real name, Detective Summers said, is Rachel Pike. We've been tracking her, or trying to, for the better part of 5 years. She has a pattern. She targets successful, recently widowed or divorced men, and lonely widows with single financially stable sons. She uses the sons as cover, a source of stable income and legitimacy, while she drains the assets of the wealthier Mark.
She pointed to the photo. She's left a trail of broken lives and empty bank accounts across 3 states. But she's slippery. She always manages to disappear before her victims realize what's happened. And most are too embarrassed or heartbroken to press charges. You two, by working together, have finally given us enough to build an ironclad case. We can get warrants for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and bigamy. A wave of pure, unadulterated vindication washed over me. I wasn't a crazy, vengeful mother-in-law. I was right. All my instincts, all my fears, they were all real. What happens now? Nathan asked, his voice tight. Now, Detective Summers said, a grim smile on her face, we let her walk into our trap. Mrs. Vance, does she still think you're just a confused old woman? I believe so, I said. That's the last card she played. Good, the detective replied. Let's use that. It's time to set the stage for the final act. The flight back to Ohio was the longest of my life. I had a plan, worked out in meticulous detail with Detective Summers, but my heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. I was about to consciously, deliberately destroy my son's world in order to save him. There was no victory in that, only a profound, aching sadness for the boy who still believed in fairy tales even as he was living with the wolf. When I got home, I gave myself one day to prepare, to shore up my own emotional defenses. Then I picked up the phone and called Thomas. I pitched my voice to sound weary, fragile, and defeated. "Thomas, it's Mom." "Hey, Mom, how was your trip? Did you have a nice time with your friend?" he asked, his tone cautious, still wary after our last conversation. "It was reflective," I said, letting out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "Listen, son, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I was wrong. I've been lonely since your father died, and I've been meddling in your life. Victoria was right. I haven't been myself. I am so sorry." There was a stunned silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the surprise warring with his suspicion. You are?" he stammered, the relief in his voice palpable. "Yes," I said, the lie feeling like poison on my tongue. "This house is too big for me, and you two deserve your happiness without me casting a shadow over it. I want to make things right. I've had my lawyer draw up the papers to sign the deed over to you and Victoria. It's my gift to you, my apology for being so difficult." Now the silence was absolute. This was more than he or Victoria could have ever dreamed of. A full, unconditional surrender. The jackpot. "Mom, I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't say anything," I said, my own voice catching, though my tears were for a different reason than he imagined. "Just come for dinner tomorrow night, the two of you. We'll sign the papers, have a nice meal, and start over. Please, son, it's what your father would have wanted." "Okay, Mom," he said, his voice now full of warmth and love. "Okay, we'll be there." Thank you. Thank you so much." I hung up the phone and closed my eyes, feeling like the worst kind of traitor. I had just used his love for me, his desire for a peaceful family, as bait in a trap. The next day, I prepared for their arrival as if for a state execution. I didn't cook an elaborate meal. I made Robert's favorite, a simple, hearty pot roast with potatoes and carrots. The familiar, comforting smell filled the house, a stark contrast to the tension coiling in my gut. I set the dining room table, the same table that we'd had countless family dinners, birthdays, and holidays, with our best china. On the sideboard, instead of a floral centerpiece, I placed two things: a sleek black portfolio containing the transfer deed and a pen, and beside it, the thick, heavy binder labeled Project Nightingale. The two objects sat side by side, the lie she thought she was getting, and the truth that was about to destroy her. They arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. Thomas came in first and gave me a hug that felt more genuine than any I had received from him in years. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered into my hair. "This means the world to us." Victoria followed, her smile dazzling. She was triumphant. She had won. She was wearing a new dress, no doubt, and carrying a bottle of expensive champagne. "To new beginnings, Eleanor," she purred, handing it to me. "Indeed," I said, taking the bottle and placing it on the counter, unopened. "Let's eat first. We can sign the papers over dessert." Dinner was surreal. Victoria was animated, effervescent, talking about their plans for the house now that it would truly be theirs. A new kitchen with marble countertops, a swimming pool in the backyard, a trip to Europe to celebrate. Thomas, relieved and happy, joined in, his face full of hope. I listened quietly, pushing food around my plate, my appetite completely gone. I felt like I was watching a movie of my own life, knowing the tragic ending that was just moments away. I made eye contact with my son over the flickering candlelight, and for a moment I almost lost my nerve. His face was so open, so full of love for a woman who was a phantom. Finally, the meal was over. I cleared the plates with hands that felt strangely steady and brought out coffee. This was it. The curtain was about to rise for the final act. "Well," I said, my voice surprisingly steady as I walked over to the sideboard, Shall we get this business out of the way? I picked up the black portfolio and the pen and placed them on the table in front of Thomas. His face lit up. Victoria leaned forward eagerly, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "But before you sign," I said, turning back to the sideboard, "I have something else I'd like you to see. A sort of wedding album I put together." I picked up the Nightingale binder. It landed on the polished wood of the table with a heavy, definitive thud. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly, sucked out of the room. Thomas looked at the binder confused. "What's that?" Victoria's face froze on her face. Her eyes were locked on the binder, a flicker of something, fear, recognition, in their depths. I didn't answer Thomas. I opened the binder. My hands were perfectly still. I looked directly at Victoria. "I've been doing some research," I said, my voice low and clear, "about my own financial planning. And in doing so, I came across some fascinating things about your business practices." I pulled out the first document, a meticulously detailed summary of her undeclared yoga income. It starts here, with what the IRS would call significant tax fraud, about $250,000 over 4 years to be precise. Thomas gasped, looking from the paper to his wife. Victoria said nothing, her face turning a pale, chalky white. I pulled out the next document. The corporate registration for Sonoran Sun Wellness, LLC. And then there's this interesting company, registered to a Catherine Schmidt in Arizona, where you've been sending all that cash.
I slid the binder across the table to my son. "Turn the page, Thomas." His hands were trembling as he opened it. On top was the wedding announcement from the Scottsdale newsletter, the smiling photo of Victoria, of Catherine, and her other husband, Nathan Wilson. "What is this?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at his wife, his eyes begging for an explanation, for this to be a mistake. "Victoria, what is this?" Victoria stared at him, her mask finally completely gone. Her face was a canvas of pure, trapped panic. "It's a lie," she hissed, her voice shrill and ugly. "Your mother is a crazy, vengeful old woman. She's making it all up. She's jealous." "Am I?" I asked softly. "Am I making up the marriage certificate from Las Vegas? Or the sworn affidavits from your other victims in Nevada and California? Or the federal arrest warrant issued for you this morning, Rachel?" The name hit her like a physical blow. She flinched, her eyes wide with terror. Thomas looked from her to me, his face a mess of confusion and dawning, unbearable horror. And, right on cue, as Detective Summers had planned, the doorbell rang. The chime of the doorbell hung in the air, sharp and final as a judge's gavel. For a moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Thomas was frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the wedding photo in the binder, as if trying to make it make sense. Rachel, Victoria, was a cornered animal, her gaze darting between me, the binder, and the front door, her mind racing for an escape route that no longer existed. I stood up from the table, my movements calm and deliberate. Every action felt heavy with significance. I walked to the door and opened it. On my doorstep, silhouetted against the deepening twilight, stood 2 figures. Detective Lisa Summers, her expression firm and professional, and beside her a grim-faced Nathan Wilson. He had insisted on being there. He had a right to see it end. "Good evening, Eleanor," Detective Summers said, her eyes looking past me into the dining room, taking in the scene. "Are we interrupting dessert?" "You're right on time, Detective," I replied, stepping aside to let them in. The sight of them entering the house was the final, undeniable blow. Thomas let out a small, choked sound as he looked at Nathan, the man from the photograph, now standing in his dining room in the flesh. The phantom had become real. Rachel, physically recoiled, stumbling back against the wall as if she'd been struck. Her carefully constructed world, her two separate lives, had just collided with catastrophic force right here in my quiet suburban home. Rachel Pike, also known as Victoria Vance, also known as Catherine Schmidt, Detective Summers said, her voice echoing in the silent room, each alias a hammer blow. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and bigamy. You can't do this, Rachel shrieked, her voice raw with desperation. The mask of sophistication was gone, replaced by the snarling fury of a trapped criminal. She turned to Thomas, her eyes pleading, trying one last desperate manipulation. Tommy, don't let them. It's a misunderstanding. This is your mother's fault. She's old and confused. She's poisoned everyone against me. Tell them, baby. Tell them you love me. But Thomas wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Nathan Wilson. In that moment, he saw not a rival, but a fellow victim. He saw the truth, stark and ugly, reflected in the other man's tired, angry eyes. He finally saw his wife for what she was, a stranger, a predator who had worn the face of the woman he loved. He said nothing. He just shook his head slowly, his face crumpling in silent devastation. His silence was the most profound condemnation of all. A second officer, who had been waiting outside, stepped forward with handcuffs. As he approached Rachel, her composure shattered completely. The charming yoga instructor, the sophisticated wife, vanished. In her place was a snarling, terrified criminal. "Get your hands off me," she screamed, struggling as the officer expertly secured her wrists behind her back. The clicking sound of the cuffs was shockingly loud in the quiet room. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she shrieked. "My lawyer will destroy you. This is entrapment." Her eyes, wild and full of hate, found mine across the room. "You," she spat with her voice dripping with venom, "you old hag. I hope you die alone in this pathetic little house. You ruined everything." I didn't flinch. I just looked at her, at the wreckage of a person who had built her life on destroying others. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, empty pity. All that intelligence, all that energy, all that charisma wasted on a life of parasitic deceit. They let her out of the house, her insults and threats echoing down the hallway until the front door closed, cutting them off. The silence she left behind was absolute, a vacuum. It was broken only by a ragged sob that escaped from my son. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, convulsive sobs. Nathan Wilson stood awkwardly for a moment, a stranger in this scene of intimate family destruction. He looked at me, his eyes conveying a silent, shared understanding of a unique and terrible betrayal. He said, I'll wait outside," he quietly said to Detective Summers. Then he nodded at me, a gesture of respect and solidarity, and slipped out the door. Detective Summers approached the table. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice softer now, "we'll need you and your son to come down to the station in the morning to give official statements. It will be hard, but it's the last step. For now, my advice is just to breathe. You did the right thing. You probably saved him from far worse." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with unshed tears. She gave Thomas's shoulder a brief, sympathetic squeeze and then left, closing the door softly behind her. And then it was just the two of us, me and my son, sitting amidst the ruins of his life at our family dinner table. The pot roast was cold, the champagne remained unopened, the house transfer deed lay on the table beside the damning binder, a testament to a future that would never be. Thomas finally looked up, his face streaked with tears, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it felt like I was looking into a chasm. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. Everything? Was it all a lie?" "I'm afraid so, sweetheart," I said, my own tears finally falling. "Mom, what have I done?" I walked over to him, my heart breaking for him, and did the only thing a mother could do.
I wrapped my arms around my broken-hearted son, held him while he wept for a life that never was, and let the silence of our shared grief begin the slow, impossible work of healing. The days that followed the arrest were a blur of muted colors and difficult, necessary conversations. The story, predictably, became a minor sensation in the local news. Suburban bigamist and con artist arrested in quiet neighborhood. The headlines were sensational, painting Rachel as a black widow and Thomas as his hapless, foolish victim. Our quiet, private lives were suddenly public property. Every trip to the grocery store was an ordeal of averted eyes and whispered conversations in the aisles. I saw the pity in our neighbors' faces, and it felt almost as bad as their judgment would have been.
Thomas was shattered. He moved out of the house, my house, the very next day, unable to bear sleeping in the bed he had shared with a stranger, unable to look at the furniture they had picked out together. He showed up on my doorstep with 2 suitcases and a vacant, haunted look in his eyes, and moved into his old childhood bedroom, the one with the faded baseball posters still on the wall. He was 32 years old, but in those first few weeks, he seemed like a lost little boy again, overwhelmed by a world that had proven to be cruel and deceptive. He barely spoke. He spent hours staring out the window or sitting silently in Robert's old armchair, a book open on his lap, its pages never turning. He had to take a leave of absence from his job. The scandal had made his position untenable. His promotion, the one that fateful dinner party had been for, was gone. His boss had been sympathetic but firm. The company needed to distance itself from the negative press. His career, which Rachel had so carefully cultivated for her own purposes, was another piece of collateral damage. There were lawyers. So many lawyers. I hired a sharp, compassionate attorney named Miss Albright to handle Thomas's side of things. The primary goal was to get an annulment, to legally erase the fraudulent marriage from his life. It was a complicated process, entwined with Rachel's ongoing criminal case. We had to file motions, give depositions, and navigate a labyrinth of paperwork that detailed the intimate and financial betrayal. Each document we signed felt like pouring salt on an open wound. Through it all, I resisted the urge to say, "I told you so." It would have been cruel and pointless. He knew. The depth of his shame was a heavy cloak he wore every day. My role was not to judge, but to support. I made him breakfast every morning, the same oatmeal with brown sugar he'd loved as a kid. I made sure he ate dinner. I sat with him in the evenings, sometimes talking about the weather or a show on TV, but mostly just sharing the silence, letting him know he wasn't alone in the wreckage. One evening, about a month after the arrest, we were sitting on the back porch as the sun went down, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words all day. "I should have listened to you," he said suddenly, his voice quiet, almost carried away by the breeze. "All those times, you and Margaret, I thought you were just being critical of her. I thought you didn't want me to be happy." "I always wanted you to be happy, Thomas," I said, looking out at the roses, their blooms beginning to fade as autumn approached. "I just wanted you to be safe, too." "She told me you were trying to control me," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the floorboards of the porch. "She said you were lonely after Dad's funeral and couldn't let go. She twisted everything. Every time you offered help, she would reframe it as you trying to keep me under your thumb. She said buying the house wasn't a gift, it was a leash, a way for you to control my life, my marriage." I felt a fresh wave of anger at the insidious, poisonous web Rachel had spun. She hadn't just stolen money, she had tried to steal my son's love and trust, to isolate him from the one person who truly cared for him. It was a classic manipulator's tactic. "And I believed her," he said, his voice breaking. "Or I wanted to believe her. Because it was easier than admitting the life we were living was a lie. I knew, deep down,
We couldn't afford it all. I saw the credit card bills, but I didn't want to question it. With her, I felt successful, important, like I was finally winning, and I was a coward. It was the first time he had taken real ownership of his part in it. It was a painful, brutal admission, but it was the first true step toward healing. "You weren't a coward," I told him, reaching over to put my hand on his arm. His muscles were tense. "You were trusting. You loved her. She exploited that. That's not your fault. That's her crime." He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything. For not defending you at that dinner, for not believing you, for letting her turn me against you." I know, sweetheart." And in that moment, the distance that had grown between us over the past 4 years, a chasm I feared was unbridgeable, finally dissolved. The legal process dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Rachel, true to her form, fought everything. Her court-appointed lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to paint her as the victim of 2 wealthy, controlling men and a vindictive, jealous mother-in-law. But the evidence was overwhelming. With Nathan's forensic accounting and my meticulous records, her lies were easily dismantled in court. The prosecution discovered at least 4 other victims in other states, though none were willing to come forward publicly, their shame still too great. We learned the full scope of her operations. She was our most ambitious project to date. Her plan, as outlined in emails found on her laptop, had been to have Thomas grant her power of attorney, then use my declining mental state to have me declared incompetent, giving her full control of my assets, including the house, my investments, and Robert's pension. The dinner party had been her opening move in that final, devastating campaign. My gut feeling had been right. The annulment was finally granted 8 months after her arrest. On paper, it was as if the marriage had never happened, but the scars remained, invisible and deep. The day Rachel Pike was sentenced was a gray, overcast day in November. Thomas and I sat in the front row of the courtroom, side by side. Nathan Wilson had flown in from Arizona and sat on my other side. We were a strange, silent trio, a support group forged in the fires of a unique betrayal. The first thing I did was put the house on the market. There were too many ghosts there, too many lies embedded in the walls. It sold quickly in the spring. I used the proceeds to buy a smaller, cozier house in a quiet neighborhood across town. It had a lovely little garden and a sunroom that was perfect for my morning coffee and my Friday financial reviews. It was a house of my own choosing, filled with my own memories. Thomas stayed with me for a few more months. He started therapy, talking to a professional who helped him unpack the years of manipulation and emotional abuse. It was hard work. There were days he was silent and withdrawn, and days he was angry, mostly at himself. But slowly, I watched my son come back to life. He started smiling again, a real smile that reached his eyes. He got a new job at a smaller marketing firm, a position with less prestige, but also less pressure. He was rebuilding his life from the ground up, on a foundation of honesty this time. 6 months after the sentencing, he found his own apartment, a small, clean place he could afford on his own salary. The day he moved out was bittersweet. I helped him hang pictures and assemble a bookshelf from a box. "You know," he said, pausing with a hammer in his hand, a smudge of dirt on his nose, "for the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe, like I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not." "That's because you're finally living your own life, Thomas," I said, handing him a nail. "And it's a good one. You're a good man." Our relationship is different now. It's stronger, deeper. The old dynamic of a doting mother and a dependent son is gone. We are two adults who respect and trust each other, bound by a shared history and a hard-won peace. We have dinner every Sunday, a new tradition in my new home. I still live alone, but I am not lonely. My life is full. I have my garden, my books, and my weekly calls with Margaret. I volunteer at the local library, helping people with their tax forms during tax season. My skills, it turns out, are still useful. Sometimes when I'm sitting in my sunroom, watching the birds at the feeder, I think about that thick binder I labeled Project Nightingale. I think about how my journey started with anger and a desire for justice, but ended with a profound understanding of love and boundaries. I learned that true protection isn't about shielding our children from the world, but about having the courage to face the truth, no matter how ugly it is. I learned that my value isn't tied to a career or what others think of me, but in my own integrity, my own quiet strength. My husband Robert's life insurance was meant to provide security, and in the end, it did, just not in the way I expected. It didn't just buy a house, it bought a painful but necessary lesson. It bought my son his freedom from a predator, and it bought me back my self-respect. It showed me that even in the quiet years of my life, I was still a force to reckon with. This journey has taught me so much about inner strength and the importance of setting boundaries, even with those we love most. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. Does any part of this resonate with your own experiences? Have you ever felt that your sacrifices were taken for granted, or that your voice wasn't being heard? I would be honored to read your perspectives in the comments below.